Okay, I was supposed to, well, first my name is Mohamed Salih Kamara. I am a professor of history, communications, and international relations at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. And I am originally from Guinea in West Africa, a former journalist for the National Radio and Television Network and a former speechwriter for the late President Sékou Touré. I was supposed to share this presentation with a colleague from Nigeria, Dr. Nyomo. Forgive me if I mispronounce her name, but apparently she's not going to be able to make it. So I will present mostly on what I consider the qualitative assessment or the qualitative exploration of the digital divide in West Africa. And the key points I would like to entertain with you this morning are the new information communication technologies and the changing of the meaning and dynamics of political representation in West Africa. Of course, this is to explore how what we consider today the new revolution in technology-based social and mass media have changed the way political representation works in West Africa. And here I'm generally considering the 15 countries that constitute ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States.
Excuse me.
Yes.
We'll just pause for a moment, if you don't mind,
Sure,
please.
sure.
We're making a slight adjustment, so your panel is a little more enriched. I have adjusted for her to be part of the panel because she's supposed to present in the afternoon. Her flight happens to coincide with that time. We have scheduling issues. So she's from the University of Zululand, and she'll be presenting after him on the title, The Impact of African Migration on Women in South Africa. So would accommodate him if you don't mind.
Absolutely not.
Thank you very much.
You are
sorry to interrupt.
Not a problem. Thank you. So the second point, in relation to the changing of the dynamics and even meaning of political representation in the 15 countries of the Economic Community of West Africa, and from time to time we will have to touch on Mauritania as the other West African country that is not included in ECOWAS since practically 1999. In relation to that, I will try to discuss with you the disparity of access to communication technology between what is considered in certain African, in the popular culture of certain West African countries as the nationals. Nationals is maybe a little bit a derogatory term, but please bear with me just for the semantic differentiation between those at home and we, the diaspora. So every time I use the term nationals here, I'm referring to the Guineans, the Ghanaians, the Nigerians, the Ivorians, etc., who reside most permanently at home, and as compared to the diaspora, we who live and work abroad. And also, I will discuss the diaspora's superior capabilities in terms of new information and communication technology, and also the freedom, the superior level of freedom of expression that they enjoy. And here I'm mostly referring to members of the West African diaspora that live either in North America, the United States and Canada notably, but also Western Europe, where the culture of freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of communication is ingrained in the political culture of the countries compared to what happens or what is happening in West Africa. And thirdly, or fourthly, I mean, the diaspora's increasing economic power and demand for political influence. The economic power of the diaspora here refers to at least two levels of intervention. One is the individual familial level of diasporic influence. For instance, as persons coming from different families, we do intervene by supporting our families by sending money, by supporting them differently for medical care and so on. But also we do intervene structurally in the national economy by starting businesses there, as small as they may be, by supporting education, by bringing in investors depending on the areas in which we work. If we are bankers, if we are businessmen and women, if we are educators, journalists, if we are lawyers, also we help to support the movements for human rights and so on to facilitate the economic globalization of our countries. So at these two levels, the diaspora intervenes economically, and as the power, the economic power of the diaspora increases, the diaspora is also demanding more and more political representation, more political clout. And finally, the disparity in what I call 21st century education opportunities and the future of citizen empowerment in West Africa. This refers essentially to the difference in access to technology-enhanced education. Children and young adults who are in school or colleges in the developed world, Europe, North America, and others, they definitely have easier access, more sustained access to a classroom like this one, but also distance learning and ready access to the internet and all its educational capabilities, whereas that cannot be taken for granted anywhere in West Africa, not in Nigeria, not in Ghana, the most advanced two countries in the region, let alone in countries that are still recovering from war, like Guinea-Bissau, like Cote d'Ivoire, or Sierra Leone or Liberia, or countries that are undergoing serious political instability like Mali, and also like my own country, Guinea. So when we look at that, we're not just looking at the here and now. We are looking forward in the next 30, 40, 50 years, what that divide, that wedge in terms of education is going to mean when we talk about empowering citizenship in terms of participation and power. So, that having been said, one of the ways that the new information and communication revolution, which has created what the specialists call the global communication society, one of the ways that has transformed the dynamics of political representation in West Africa in general is the emergence of a polycentric civil society. Civil society in the sense that these are essentially voluntary organizations that come together around shared ideals and ideas. Located somewhere between the family, the state, and businesses. They are not for-profit businesses, but they are not disconnected from the business community. They are not portions of the state. They are not agents of the state, but they are not totally disconnected from the state in the sense that they are citizen organizations ruled by the state. They are not representatives of the family structure, but individuals emanate from families, so they are within the triangulation of state, business, and family, and we have NGOs that are centered on women's rights and interests, youth interest, religious organizations, labor, and so on. So with the diversification of civil society, which is no longer compounded within, say, labor organizations. We know, for instance, up until the mid-70s, or actually I dare say all the way to the mid-80s, most of what would be called civil society organizations, CSOs in West Africa, were organized around either labor unions, where they existed independently from the state, or religious organizations, church-sponsored organizations, mosque-sponsored organizations, and so on. Maybe in Ghana, for example, where you have the powerful guilds of market women who are seriously to be contended with in Ghana if you want to achieve anything. And I have done some kind of interviews there last summer, and believe me, they are a quiet power. You don't want to wake them up in the wrong way. So besides those, it's only from the late 80s, early 90s to now in many countries in West Africa that we have this diversification of civil society. That is the positive outcome I suggest to you, or I argue, the positive side of the emergence of polycentric civil society. Now, the biggest challenge then is how to create a synergy between all these different organizations. When does, say, a female professor at the University of Accra, Ghana, who is also a member of a women's organization somewhere in the Ashanti region in northern Ghana, but also is a member of the National Assembly of Ghana. So where does she fit? As a female faculty member in the state-owned university system of Ghana, or as a woman in a women's organization in a particular region in Ghana, or as a member of the state, being an elected official in the parliamentary system. So when we take that particular individual and we multiply that by how much we don't know, we see not only there is a diversification within the individual, the entity is compartmentalized into different sectors, but also we have different individuals, different groups that are sliced according to interest. The challenge is how to bring all these together under the umbrella of the nation, because we are trying to build nations in Africa in general. And NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have sponsored the creation of mass media, be they regular radio stations as we know them, or be they web-based call-in talk shows, or even the social media, or online newspapers, and so on. We see NGOs sponsoring these, and through them, we see a better way of creating that synergy by recognizing the legitimacy of the ideals of each cluster of non-governmental organizations within the civil society organizations of Africa. On the other hand, however, the new information and communication revolution has changed the meaning and dynamics of representation politically by creating what I call a polycentric political constituency. Here, we are mostly dealing with political parties or para-political organizations, which means that the same citizens we encountered earlier through the NGOs, voluntary organization based on ideas and ideals shared by all. Here we find them in the structures of competition for power, for political power. The dynamics change because we have here individuals who follow, and this is a fundamental problem in some of our countries, and definitely in my own country, Guinea, where ethnocentricity has become an unwritten rule to define political pluralism. I do not support him because as a candidate for National Assembly or presidency or whatever national office, I'm not supporting him necessarily because I'm convinced by his political program, by the program of his party, the platform upon which he is running. I'm supporting him because he is my kin. Because I believe that there is no national government. The government that is here, the structures, the institutions are national, but the men and women who are in charge of running them are not national. They cater to a certain regional, religious, ethnic entity based on the political affiliations that they created to come to power. So we see some kind of clientelism that is created here between the rulers and the ruled, and there is a whole chain to say so, which means that once he becomes the president of the republic, he has to know that we invested in him, which is a big problem. And political parties are catering to that. So on the one hand, we have a consolidation of multi-party politics, but on the other hand, we wonder how to transcend the political, ethnic, and other forms of polarization and promote healthy political pluralism. This is where I believe specialists of political communication and specialists of technology-based social communication need to reflect seriously how to bridge these two sides of the gap and make West Africa, and Africa in general for that matter, a serious candidate to the positive utilization of 21st century communication without dividing themselves. And this is where we find, for instance, what I call political pundit-sponsored mass media. For instance, in the United States and here in Canada, there are a lot of Africans who own or operate web-based radio stations. And I have the good fortune to be invited from time to time on those. And please believe me, if you haven't listened to them yet, and I assume that you have even participated from time to time also, you hear a lot of things that are symptomatic of the situation we live in Africa. And that is a serious problem because it is highly divisive. Now, the next thing is the disparity in technology-supported education and its impact on the future of citizen empowerment in West Africa. As I indicated earlier, there is a big difference between education in the developed world today and education in the underdeveloped world. Here I'm talking about the global digital divide. Coming from the old school of cavemen, I used to try to limit my students' reliance on all these new technologies, smartphones, iPads, and everything in the classroom, because sometimes I don't know what they're searching, if it has anything to do with what we are discussing. However, I realize that this is it's self-defeating. Better join them I'm not using the term if you can't defeat them, join them, but better join them and together with the students, see how it can best be used as a form of, as a tool, a dynamic tool of education. So at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, which is mostly a technology-based university, I have no idea what I'm doing there because my technological knowledge is challenged at best. But because I teach international relations and communication and history, which are fundamental to the general education program, we designed, in my department, we designed courses. Some are called hybrid and others, professors design theirs differently. One that I designed last year was called Inquiry-Guided Learning, whereas you allow students to define research projects. And you encourage them to design those projects that will be more effectively researched through the internet. And through that process, throughout the semester, you guide them into researching the data, analyzing the data, presenting it, and criticizing one another in groups. The bottom line is to help them know the difference between retrieving information and researching knowledge, so that they know in class they can do it and you trust them in it. So how can we in West Africa make sure that something that a student in Canada, in the United States, France, and Germany, who is originally from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Guinea, Senegal, Mali, and elsewhere, that kind of educational support that they gain here, they will be instrumental in developing that kind of networking back in Africa. You don't have to go back to Africa and dwell there anymore if there are possibilities to connect to the outside world, to your country, your region, and do something that can level the playing field in generations to come. Because besides that, without that, I don't see how citizen empowerment is going to happen fairly in the future. Now, there is what I call the horizontal disparity in terms of access to information, technology supported communication between nationals and the diaspora. First, if you came to the United States the time I came in 1986, 87, you know that you could stay here a whole month without hearing from your parents on the phone because it wasn't that easy. It wasn't readily available to everybody. But now you have a 17-year-old nephew or niece or son or daughter who is always on the phone, talking to friends back in Africa, even sometimes when driving. Somebody's cell phone rings today, it's an emergency. You have to find it. We men, we go through all the pockets. Ladies, God bless you. The purse has to bring it. So when we take it that way, we wonder from one generation to another, how can we fill the gap between those generations? Earlier generations of West African immigrants in North America, whose objective, whose American or Canadian dream is to enable their children, the second generation, to have the kind of education that they may not have enjoyed when they were growing up in Africa. And when it goes that way, it is a new generation of disconnected West African citizens that are being positively created. It's not negative, but how can that positivity be translated into a reconnection with West Africa without lowering the standards of education of these children that we are bringing into North America, for example? Now, infrastructural and financial problems in West Africa do not facilitate very quickly that connection. We need to reflect on that. But also, as I indicated earlier, the diaspora enjoys more freedom of expression. If you have your radio station or any other form of web-based or not web-based mass medium in North America or Western Europe, for instance, chances are you have more freedom of expression than somebody who runs a community radio station in Ségou in Mali, for example. Because the legal and regulatory environment in our countries, even though we have all the laws on paper, sometimes we have more laws than the developed democracies compared. For instance, as of 2007, the Constitution of Guinea was twice longer than the Constitution of the United States. More articles than you had in a constitution that is more than 200 years old. But the problem is, nobody abides by the Constitution. Nobody even knows what the Constitution says. So you go to the paper, to the book, we have all the laws. But in real life, those laws are, as they say, made to be broken, which is dangerous as a form of political culture. Now, the regional organizations in West Africa, one of which, the paramount one, is the Economic Community of West African States, but there are also others, have devised a series of resolutions and laws to facilitate access to information, dissemination of information, without the criminalization of journalists and citizen journalists. Citizen journalists here essentially based on social communication, and that also has to be addressed because professional journalists are very resentful of what would be called citizen journalists unless they can use the help of citizen journalists. For instance, when Abdoulaye Wade was first elected president of Senegal, it was essentially citizen journalists who from the polls would call radio stations, newspapers, TV stations, and report the vote count. That wasn't logged officially because they were not mandated to do that. But that held the professional journalist to account, because they knew that it was already known that if you say Abdoulaye Wade lost here and Abdou Diouf, the incumbent, won, whereas they know that it's not the case, you're in trouble. So in those cases, for instance, citizen journalism was integrated into the promotion of democratization by the professional journalist core. The vertical disparity would be between urban and rural nationals. And this is where I talk about the domestic digital divide. In most of West African countries, the internet and its multimedia capabilities are essentially mostly available in the capital city and a very few big cities around. Elsewhere, it's tabula rasa. People don't have access to it because it doesn't exist, because the infrastructure is not there, because in some cases there is not even electricity, which means that even if you can afford a computer, You cannot connect it because the infrastructure doesn't exist. And even in the capital cities, for instance, because it's not like you and I here who can just take your, it's no longer the desktop or the laptop, it's your, your iPad or your smartphone. Anywhere you are, you can access it. In West Africa, that's not the case yet. You have the cyber cafes where the price is exorbitant. How much money do you pay for 15 minutes? And if you have to pay that much money, believe me, you have your priorities. And students in the colleges and universities of West Africa who come on vacation to Europe and here and discover the eye-opening interconnectedness through the World Wide Web, where you can find so much information. And you go there, there is none. It's like they are starving. And that state of intellectual hunger due to the lack of connection is what I consider here the vertical disparity, first between urban and rural nationals, and urban nationals be more connected to the outside world. We have an extroverted system of communication here, whereas, for instance, the Minister of Communication or the National Director of Communication of a West African country has more opportunities to communicate with people around the world than to communicate with the governor of a state in his own country 50 miles down the street. So, yes, sir.
Since you're running this yourself and since she needs to go in, I'm just wondering whether, because we need to wrap up by 10:30, right? So
okay.
I'm just curious about having somebody monitor, because I know how difficult it is when you are monitoring yourself, right?
Actually, I'm done. This is the last. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So with all what I just said combined, here are some of the questions I raise. How will this impact of national representation in West, how will this, meaning the digital divide, impact national representation in West Africa? Is it bound to make the diaspora a catalyst for sustainable and balanced representation? Or will it turn the diaspora into a vector of unwarranted foreign influence in the name of globalization? Or else, will it widen and deepen the wedge between nationals and the diaspora? And finally, what should states, civil society organizations, and businesses, what should they do, forgive me, so as to capitalize on plurality and mitigate division? I believe as specialists, as scholars, these are among many other key questions that we need to reflect on as we try to help West African countries and African countries in general to better take advantage of the 21st century revolution in information and communication technology. Thank you very much.
Do you want to do yours before we go to questions? Otherwise, we might eat into your time. So why don't you do yours?
My computer? Yeah, so you should be... Yes? This is it? Yeah. Okay, here you go. I'll let you pick it. Here's, this is... Oh, mouse.
working?
Yeah,
Just
Oh, yeah, unfortunately, you can't.
The slideshow
just have a
doesn't work.
slide for some reason, so you'll just have to leave it there and click on each one. Is that okay?
that's fine.
Sorry.
Okay. Sorry to impose myself on you. Okay, this is part of my PhD thesis. It's like a chapter, and I'm still collecting data. But from the literature review and the focus group interview, that is what I'm going to talk about: the impact of African migration on women in South Africa. A case of Umhlatuze. South Africa is a big nation. Umhlatuze is situated in KwaZulu-Natal. It's one of the most populous provinces with a lot of African immigrants. Okay. Okay. Forget about the number of my slides. I'm just going to say it like a story and slip through. Migration. There's been contentions about what migration is. The issue of space. How far do you move before we can say it's migration? And the issue of time. How long do you have to reside in a place before we can say it's migration? I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to use Wick's definition of migration that says it is the permanent change in place of residence over a period of time. So that's what migration is. And now in the past, migration has always been from the underdeveloped countries or the undeveloped countries to the south, the developed countries from south to the north. But Roth, which is a scholar, found out something, that there has been a change of migration recently, and it's natured like this, the SouthSouth Migration, which has become, I have to move the slide, sorry, which has become very popular right now. And what Rother says is that people now move within the southern or the developing or underdeveloped countries. And if you check the nature of this migration or the pattern of this migration, you find out that South Africa has become the new Europe of Africa, probably because of its level of development. I teach my development students and I say, South Africa, if I was coming to this Carleton, I don't know the area, this university, and what washed through my mind was, this place is as beautiful as South Africa. There's really no difference in structure. But when I teach them and I tell them that South Africa has the structure of a developed country, but the poverty of, if not worse, of underdeveloped country. The poverty we see in South Africa is worse than the poverty we see in a place like Nigeria or in a place like Ghana. There's serious, serious poverty where people kill over 5 rand. 5 rand is like Canadian dollars now. It's less than a Canadian dollar. A Canadian dollar is like 8 rand, so maybe 3/4 of a Canadian dollar. People stab each other and kill each other for that. That's the level of poverty. Because of the, should I say, mirage or the outside beauty of how South Africa looks, there have been influx of migration. People from not just Southern Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, but even people from West Africa. And that is, the migration stock was provided by Ngwenya, which, as migration scholars, we try not to take as law, because illegal migrants, you cannot really find them to get their statistics. But this is what it showed. At 2007, the migrant stock of South Africa, you find that Zimbabwe, because they share a common border, next door neighbors, has the highest. But it also shows that people from Ghana are represented. I don't know why Nigeria is not there, but believe me, there are a lot of Nigerians in South Africa. There's a place they call Hillbrow. When you go there, you think you're in Lagos, in South Africa. Okay, sorry, I'm quite clumsy. Now, because of this, I want to find out, people have done studies. If you go through the migration literature, you see the god of migration crushes around, the goddess Dodson, they're around. They've all done studies on migration, the impact of migration, and they've come up to say South Africa is xenophobic, which is hatred for immigrants or foreigners. Some people say it's Afrophobia, which is hatred for African migrants. But little studies have been done on how it has impacted on the South African women. And that's the area that I try to find out. What do these women in Umhlatuze say about immigration to South Africa? And from this, these are my research questions. What are the implications of African immigration to South Africa? What is the gender character of this migration? And how do the women feel about the phenomenon of African migration in South Africa? Okay. I did 2 focus group interviews with South African women. Plateauze has different areas. Felixton, Buvundelag, Walazana, Crown Bonambe, Pangani, Richards Bay. These are semi-urban towns. You find out that Richards Bay is as beautiful as, where are we, Ottawa? And you find out that Ngolazana is as rural as any other rural area. So it's a mix of different kinds of people. Now, my theoretical consideration is from the gender role theory. The gender role theory says through socialization or through life experiences, women and men have been given different roles in life. He's made to be, sorry sir, he's made to be the boss in the house. He should be respected as a man, you must respect him as a man. And I as a woman, my job is in the kitchen. I should serve him, I should clean for him. It depends on where you come from. But KwaZulu-Natal is a very, very patriarchal society in KZN. It's also known to be one of the most violent areas or province in South Africa because of history of war. And you find out that through research, I'm deviating a little, through research, the gender research done by Chris Sike, you find out that there is a lot of women violence due to patriarchy. You have, if you listen to the news, you hear of women being violated, raped, children, daughters, and all that. It's a very patriarchal society. Now, my argument is if we are viewed differently, if I am supposed to be the subordinate, or if I'm viewed as a subordinate or the lesser sex, then that role should be translated in the way immigration impact on me. The way he will experience immigration would be different or quite dynamic from the way I would experience immigration because of our different roles. He is a man and I'm a woman. That's what I try to find out, if it's really true. Okay. Now the first question was the impact of African migration on society in South Africa. Now there are 2 coins, 2 sides of the coin. Positively, it has been argued that South Africa has experienced brain gain. It's a dynamic society. After 1994 apartheid, we all know about apartheid, the government, the apartheid government, the separationist policy. After the liberation of the African race and the non-African race, the Asians and the Indians, there were a lot of brain drain. A lot of skilled, the white race migrated to places like Canada, to places like America because of the fear of revenge or the fear of back the African government, ANC has come in, maybe they'll probably hit back or any other thing. And then there was a big vacuum in the skill industry till today. For example, I'm a migrant and I'm teaching. It's supposed to be impossible because they have a policy called the BEE, the Black Empowerment Policy. It says, first you must employ an African woman. If you don't say an African woman, then you employ an African man. If in the whole of, when I mean African, I don't mean immigrants, I mean the South African indigene, like he said, a national. If you don't say an African woman, you get an African man. If you don't get an African man, then you get a colored, that's the mixed race. If you don't get a colored woman, you get a colored man. If you don't get a colored man, you get a white woman. If you don't get a white woman, then you get a white man. If you don't get a white man, then you can get an African woman. If you don't get an African woman, then you can get an African man. So you find out that for me to be employed, there is serious competition, but it's because of the brain drain. A lot of skilled people immigrated, and the African migrants, luckily for, not luckily, I mean it's a good word, fortunately or whatever, most African migrants are skilled. So you have a lot of African doctors, Nigerians, Cameroonians, Ghanaians. If you do your statistics, you find that in almost all schools, you find there must be a foreign maths teacher. Recently, the government came out to say, we're having a problem with employing maths teachers, and they went to Nigeria to get maths teachers to come teach them. So migration has actually helped them in brain gain to balance the brain drain situation. And it has helped in regional and continental integration. I taught in UKZN first year, and luckily there was an American HOD, and I was reviewing their scheme. And the first thing I saw was, why would you be asking people what is the capital of Nigeria in exam? What is the capital of Zambia? And he said, have you ever heard of South African exceptionalism? And I said, no. I never took it to heart. But after staying in the country for 2 years, I found that South Africans, genuinely speaking, are not aware of Africa. Not their fault, because of apartheid. Apartheid closed them away from Africa. There was no migration to Africa. There was no relationship. So everybody that is seen, Masinkle did a study. If you remember the May incidents of 2011, where I know you heard it on news, there were killings of foreign migrants. They came to people and said, okay, he is dark skinned. Sorry. He is dark skinned with thick lips. So he is African migrant. Whereas he looks a lot like a vendor. A lot of vendor South Africans were killed for this appearance. And whenever they see me and they greet me, Salvo, and I is a Zulu name, and I'm like, sorry, I'm not South African, I don't speak Zulu. Why do you look like us? Why are you light-skinned, you know? And I found out, and I did a research with cultural integration, you can see my name there, and I found out that because of apartheid, you see that South Africans were locked out of Africa. Name countries in Africa, I asked my students, and they don't go beyond Zambia, Nigeria, Botswana. Have you not heard of Togo? Someone told me Mali is in America. You know, and you find out, well, but it's helped a lot now. Now you see there are women in their parliaments dressing like Nigerians. Some students, I see them because of the Nigerian movies, they tell me, Ekaro, they speak languages, and you find that there's cultural integration. But on the negative side, there has been great conflict of resources. Conflicts due to competition for resources. The space has been encroached upon because there are really no jobs. In the primary sector, the skilled level, there are a lot of jobs. Every Sunday, you see Sunday Times advertising, we need directors, we need doctors, we need lecturers. But down there where you have the clerks, and unfortunately a large chunk of population of the South African people, at that level, you find that there's competition of resources and competition for jobs. There are crimes, and mostly drug stealing and armed robbery, and diseases. The perception is migrants coming with all sorts of diseases. I have my reservations for that. And last and foremost, it's xenophobia and Afrophobia, which is a big thing. It's a really big thing. There were killings and special assignments. There was a woman that took a rock and actually crushed a little boy. It was on TV, it was on news. We all saw the program. There's serious xenophobia. Masinke and Crush there, they call it Afrophobia because if you are a migrant from Europe or from America, you are seen as a tourist. He did a study there. It's in 306 if you're interested. If you're a migrant from, let's say Canada, you're seen as a tourist, you have something to offer. But if you're a migrant from Africa, you are seen as someone who has come to steal our women or take our jobs or spread diseases, okay? It's a perception the government has tried to change, and we pray we don't have another May 11 incidents. I don't know, I would have brought the picture of migrants being burnt to death and the police standing looking without doing anything. The impact of African migration on women in South Africa. Now, through literature review, I found that the impact of African migration have a gender character that needs to be researched more. One, it's marriage. Most, because of the laws to protect jobs and encroachments due to the influx of immigrants, most women became targets for legal documents. Some were married immigrants, and then, real or fake, but I'll concentrate on the fake, they went to Home Affairs, got married, and then these migrants sometimes went back home, leaving the women stranded, and there was a whole documentary and a lot of press media on women that couldn't access grants or couldn't access any legal documents or couldn't marry again because they were married to migrants, and the migrant husband was nowhere to be found. And there was cultural socialization. Women became exposed to the cultures of the outside world, the African world, and feminization of poverty this is a part of gender story that says poverty affects women more than men because of the, like I said, the socialization, the social role placed on women. Take, for example, sorry, we are married and he's the father, is a father, I have 3 children, we are both poor. He could go migrate or go somewhere to Toronto to look for a job, and I'm stuck with the children. I have to nurture and care. So when poverty is feminized, it really affects the women more. That's what the story says. Okay, sorry. Now, from my focus group interview, these were the information I got. 1. Most male African migrants marry South African women for legal stay in the country, and most of these South African women married just for legal documents end up being single mothers and legally stuck when the migrant husbands return to their sending countries. In other words, South African women are usually used as a means to an end. I just edited the language, but this was what they said. African women migrants from neighboring Southern African countries encroach into women's sector, which is the domestic labor, increasing their poverty burden. South African women are increasingly used as pawns to carry out criminal activities carried out by some migrants. And the argument was because women are poor and women experience poverty more due to their weaker roles or weaker characteristic in quote, they are usually used as pawns to carry out criminal activities. African migration has also led to cultural mix, and this threatens the culture of the Zulus, which has led to the loss of values of South African women. The Zulu tribe is very cultural, very, very cultural. I wish you could come for the Zulu dance, rig dance. People come from America, people come to see it. They are very cultural. Like we in Nigeria or your country, our traditional attire has changed. We have some contemporary looks, but the Zulu is still raw. You see them nothing with just the beaded skirts and their spears. They are very cultural. Migration, which has led to cultural mix, from the focus group interview, she saw it as a bad thing, that the culture is being threatened. An old, aged culture that was preserved even through apartheid, now the cultural integration has threatened and lost the value for their culture. Most South African women have been abandoned or disowned by family because of marrying African migrants. That is usually not an accepted norm. There is a derogatory word for African migrants. I wish there was a South African here. If I say the word, he knows. You don't call a migrant amakrekre. It's derogatory. It's a bad word, okay? So if you come with the migrant husband and the first thing the migrant husband is talking like me, amakrekre, which is, it means the literary meaning is you sound strange, someone that speaks in strange language, but it is derogatory and abandoned or disowned by the family. Therefore, it's seen as a threat to the family as a social unit. In conclusion, African migration has impacted in a dynamic way on the lives of South African women because of their gender-constructed roles. Most studies on the subject of migration focus on trends in mega big cities. This study has focused on trends and views from smaller towns and semi-urban towns. It is expected on completion that it shall add new and nuanced knowledge on the subject of African immigration to South Africa with focus on women. Thank you. I hope I wasn't too fast. Thank you. Should we just take it out?
There's questions for
What is
You guys want to field your own questions?
Admin?
Questions? You guys want to
Stand up for
field
questions.
questions?
Okay, be careful. I'm an African immigrant here.
So I've got questions and comments for you.
Yes.
So when you talk about polycentric civil society and the polycentric legal environment now, you talk about that. What I'm curious about is the dialectics between that, what seems to be centric, feudal forces happening at the same time as you have this notion of plurality, right? And so you've got plural systems, and you're arguing that that is, in some sense, you've got fissures within these political landscapes, right? So you've got centrifugal forces bringing people together, but it's simply got the centrifugal forces going on. And I'm just curious about the dialectics of that interaction and what that means in terms of the sustainability of that democratic process that you're talking about, and relating it to your construct of vertical versus horizontal distinctions. And I'm just curious about whether the extent to which those concepts define the nature of the relationship between the diaspora and home, right? Because the assumption there is that the diaspora doesn't have those vertical differences, and that the digital divide somehow, because when you talk about vertical, you talk about in terms of rural, urban, and you talk about horizontal as though within, what, I guess my question would be, what is it that defines the variables and the vertical and the horizontal, right? Because my understanding of the diaspora, landscape is that you've also got those divisions. They may not be as accentuated as it is at home, but certainly you've got, different calibrations among that diaspora group as well. And so the notion of this being vertical, defined just by location, which is I think how you define it, and not looking at some of the socioeconomic differences that, attend your definition of the domestic, right? So just some clarity about those concepts. And finally, the applicability of the notion of digital divide in a continent that is adopting other platforms that are in fact shrinking that divide, right? And so when you look at the digital divide in terms of internet access or computer use and so on, the gap is probably yawning. But at the same time, if you look at it in terms of the significant explosion in mobile telephony, for example, that the concept does not quite fit, right, as much as it may do with regard to the other types of technologies. So to what extent is that concept applicable across multiple platforms? Or are we kind of ossified in time and looking at it in relation to particular types of technologies? And then for you, just a quick question about the, it just seems to me that when you talk about Africans going to South Africa because of the physical beauty, as you go on, it seems to me that there's much more complex explanation for that in migration, right? It's obvious that if people are beginning to get into tension with locals about jobs and so on, there's obviously some pull factor that is sending these folks in there beyond just the glamour of that space. But I also wonder the extent to which some of the things that you refer to as impacts for women are in fact not necessarily related just to immigration, right? Because some of the issues around what patriarchy does in terms of family units, South African families are, even outside of the migrant experience, very much torn apart, right? For a variety of reasons, whether it has to do with the labor migration that happens and people, and this goes way back to apartheid times, but also even in contemporary society with a lot of the violence that are visited on women and so on. So the extent to which we can lay some of those issues around feminization of poverty on the doorsteps of migration, it seems to me, will require more teasing, right, to be able to establish those relationships. Because outside of that migrant experience, you still have those things going on. So to what extent are the extrapolations, supportable by the evidence? To what extent are we making leaps in logic, right, based on, I might be able to find this and so on, right? So just those are my musings about when you talk about it.
You want to go first?
Okay. I should have written it down. but what I was saying was, yes, South African family units is broken and irregular, single parenting, teenage pregnancy. I studied as a neutral person. If you asked me if I was engaging with the people in the focus group interview, I would have said yes, but how do you, if you've studied South African migration, we found that the migrants have been used as scapegoats. Last year I came here and I did the impact of migration and why people migrated, and there were a whole lot of this. It's not just for jobs. Some people said it's because of natural disaster. Some people said because of the African love for Africa, they want to go over. Some people said no option because of the tightening of immigration into the developed world. There were a whole lot of reasons. But for my information concerning the women, I just put it as I got. I didn't want to tamper with the data saying reverting their family units. We have proposed.
Right.
Yeah, I could have proposed it when I'm writing the paper, but now I just presented. If you see what I wrote, I put the perceptions of what they said.
Right.
I agree with you. Their family units, if you know, before apartheid, the men migrated to Egoli, Joburg, and the women were left alone. The men had wives in Egoli, the women had boyfriends. So the whole family unit was all. Or if they blame it on migration,
I just wondered, why you define this as, what was the research problem, right? Basically what it is that brought you to this question in the first place. Why the focus on this, on the women, right? So I'm just curious about where this is coming from. What exactly the problem is that elicited this study. Right?
Okay, my PhD is on integration of African. I want to check the level of integration between African migrants and South African citizens. Okay, and there is a chapter on cultural mix, which actually it's not just on women, it's the impact on men separately and the impact on women separately. And I was going to compare. So I just picked out this to research it. That's why. I'm not a gender expert.
Okay, thank you. About the, you done?
Any other question?
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, about the dialectic between the what I call the polycentric civil society and the polycentric political landscape. I agree with you. There is a dialectic there, and also I would suggest that at a certain level we need to take it from country to country, and also from time to time, even within the same country. For instance, around very contested national elections, whether in Senegal recently, or in Guinea, or in Benin, and so on, we see the polycentric civil society landscape being actually a cement to bridge the political gaps. When we see, for instance, the same individuals or the same groups belonging to particular civil society organizations. These are essentially grassroots organizations, but finding themselves on different sides of the political fence during the political campaign, where things are heated, where there is polarization. There have been studies that indicated that the fact that these people belong together in civil society organizations helped attenuate, helped mitigate the political animosity, which otherwise could have degenerated into conflict, physical conflicts, and so on. Which means, tells me, and I stand corrected here, that even the polycentric political landscape may be more heated around election times. That in between, there is some more, I wouldn't call it a merger, but some kind of compatibility, social compatibility between the civil society landscape and the political landscape. Now, I don't know if I answered your question on that. Okay. Now, the vertical versus the horizontal digital divide, yes, within the diaspora, everybody is not on the same level. We have, university professors like you and I, or we also have cab drivers. We have, there is also a vertical. There is inequality there, economic, technological, and so on. But this inequality somehow in the developed world, within the West African diaspora in Canada, in the United States, in France, and elsewhere, I do believe is less intense than the digital divide between intellectuals, doctors, professors, and others living in Abuja versus the mass of semi-nomadic people in northern Nigeria, for instance, just to take that example. So the vertical divide does exist within both sides, the nationals and the diaspora. But I believe what is what mostly affects representation here is that within the diaspora, there are better ways to connect even the disconnected segments of the diaspora itself. Almost everybody can have access to some kind of technological communication within Canada, for instance, even if they are hairbreaders, can barely read or write in French or English, but there are some ways to communicate. In our rural areas in Africa, in West Africa, it is more challenging. Of course, and this takes me to your third question, the mobile telephony. It's not as demanding, economically, financially, and intellectually. You don't have to be very intellectual to use a cell phone. You have a little bit, you need to know how to dial numbers, and the cell phone is not that expensive. So there is that kind of communication. But I do believe that is mostly, at most, it's at the level of social media. And when I talk about the disconnect, it's not just the social media. And experience has proven that the social media in West Africa is seriously limited by the political and social landscape upon which the people who don't have access to, say, the internet, for example, and others, don't have much control over. So their representativity at the national level is still lessened by the environment. But yes, I do agree with you. We are not stuck back in the the 80s or 90s. The telephony, the explosion in mobile telephony has changed that disconnect. There is less disconnect there and than it was before. Yes, sir.
Okay, similar to the question and wisdom posed, in your discussion on polycentric political constituents, correct me if I'm wrong, the impression I got was that you made the argument that there's so much social cleavages based on ethnicity, what have you, etc., which tends to, should I say, undermine the national unity amongst others. And then you also referred to the political, the media situation where there's so much divisions. How different is it from that one which pertains in established democracies, for example? Because you also tend to find these divisions. I'm sure anybody in Canada realizes that, well, the conservatives will generally do very well in Western Canada, or even in US, where you're coming from, the so-called northern, the blue states and the red states. Why is it different in West Africa amongst others?
I think the fundamental problem here is when you take the blue states and the red states. I'm not going to venture into Canadian politics because I'm not well versed in that. But the blue states and the red states in the United States of America, even though the election and re-election of Barack Obama was essentially, well, the youth, women, and minorities in general were really his people. But it's not necessarily based on what we know in Africa as the primordial ethnic definition of interrelations. I'm not voting for you because you are Igbo, I'm Igbo. I'm not voting for her because she's Yoruba, I'm Yoruba. Or there have been some staunch opponents to Barack Obama in the last election because they believe he failed his blackness. during the first 4 years of his. And I mean, these are African Americans.
But when a minority, I mean, he still had 94, 95%.
Yes, yeah, no, I understand. I understand that. I understand. I'm not rejecting that. I personally voted for Barack Obama twice. I have no idea why. Yes, but because I'm black, he's black. That's the truth. That's the truth. But also, my wife is white, and she voted for Barack Obama, which may not be the case if I were in Guinea as a Soso and a Fulani wife voting between a Soso candidate and a Fulani candidate. So you see, I'm not saying that I indoctrinated my wife. She was Democratic before I came to America. But that's the small point I'm trying to make there.
Can I just add, in the American society, you have, like in my studies on integration and citizenship, there is the sense of an American citizen. I am a Canadian citizen. There's a sense of nationhood built around the state. But in most African, like you said, they'll kill me now, a confusion of identity. For example, if I'm from Nigeria, if I go to I'm married to an Isoko man, and there was a time we walked in and they saw my name, the Isokos bear Efe, and they're like, oh yeah, Efe, yeah. That's the first identity they want to be. You know, they are ethnic nations, and ethnic nations opposes the state sometimes. Okay? People are more affiliated to ethnic nations. Not that it's a bad thing. Ake said the state failed, and because the state failed, ethnic nations had to serve as the next option for serving. So you find.
But there's, I think there's an assumption here that these are, binaries, right? But in the States, there's a lot of attack. I think even the concept of primordialism is infused with a setting, old imperialist anthropological, framework, right? Because if somebody is, because the nativistic impulses in the United States are very strong. And if you don't call that primordialism, and then you only refer to it in terms of ethnic differences, it seems to me that we need to problematize the concept itself and look at how it infuses politics, whether it's somebody's attachment to religion as faith or something else. And so the notion that somehow Africans exhibit primordialist tendencies, whereas people in the West don't, or if you're somewhere in Germany and you don't think that a Turk who's been in Germany all their life is not fit to be German, I think we need to, kind of problematize these concepts and their use in different, areas. So I'm concerned about the fact that there's a setting wholesale, acceptance of these as defining particular areas and not others, right? And that troubles me somehow. Because I do see manifestations of the same kinds of, people in the South, no matter who you are, they look at you as a Northerner. And you're coming from those Yankees from up north, they're never going to support you. And so somehow to make the case that these are, in fact, I agree with you, there's a certain sense of nationalism in the United States, but it is not divorced from attachment to parochial interests as well that we need to recognize, right? So.
Very quickly, I do agree with you, but I do believe also, if you compare, historically speaking, the age of the Canadian nation, for instance, we still have the Quebecois who are more French in their outreach, and from Paris, even though the French nationalistically recognize the Quebecois, but when you say why instead of we, they say, oh yeah, that's Quebec. So there is that kind of thing. So I do agree when you go to the south of the United States. By the way, I live in Florida. That's the most southern way you can go. There is that kind of mentality of Yankee versus South in the Civil War, and so. But what I'm mostly, as a historian, political historian, concerned about when I'm talking about Africa in general, is how do we emerge it's 50 years or so since decolonization. How do we process this whole thing to come to a Nigerianness, a South Africanness, without denying the values of being a Zulu in South Africa or a Hausa Fulani in Nigeria, but still identifying yourself at least on the same level, which I believe we haven't reached yet. Because when push comes to shove in America, regardless of who you are, after 9/11, for example, you're going to see Americans who otherwise a few days earlier would be not speaking to one another, embracing one another, and so on. Actually, so in Africa, usually that's it. We haven't reached that level yet because of maybe the age of our nations.
But wouldn't you find that same sense of integration in sports, for example?
Exactly.
I mean, Nigeria has played soccer. It doesn't matter whether Okacha is from the north or Guinea is from the south, or they all see themselves as Nigerians playing under the green, which I don't want to see. Being a proud Ghanaian.
Yeah. Definitely, maybe I have some national predisposition to go that route here. Let me just very quickly give you an example. I'm Camara. And in Guinea, particularly in Western Africa, from Senegal, from Liberia and Sierra Leone, all the way to Mali, Senegal, and others, Camara is like Jones in America or Smith. Now, because you find Camaras in all ethnic groups in Guinea, when in 1993 there were elections in Guinea, presidential elections, the people who supported the president, Conte, had roadblocks in the socio-dominated one. People who supported Alpha Conde had roadblocks in the Maninka, all different areas. As a Camara, I could drive around, and everywhere I go, I belong there. When you take it, you're going to say, thankfully. But when you really reflect deeply in it, you see the problem, that you are not taken as a national citizen, but as a representative of different clusters. That I'm not trying to, to primitivize Africans, but I'm just trying to show the challenges that we face.
So how do you deal with it? I mean, since...
Well, that's what we're doing, reflecting on them and eventually impacting what is going on positively. Thank you very much.